De aquí ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
If Trump was serious about pursuing good relations with Russia, then how could the U.S. keep up its pressure to freeze Russia out of Europe and keep the Ukrainian Nazi regime in a constant state of war against its own Russian-speaking population? The war party in the U.S., and that war party is both Republican and Democrat, had worked hard to put the U.S. back on a constant war footing after George Bush was forced to pull out of Iraq. But what happened was that this bipartisan war party, and with the national security state in the lead, they were in a panic. They decided that Donald Trump couldn't be trusted with the keys to the empire. So they all piled into Hillary Clinton's overstuffed campaign tent. And for the first time ever, current and former heads of the CIA got directly involved in presidential election politics, and they became involved as Democrats. When Trump won his victory in the Electoral College, the CIA produced a document claiming that the Russians and WikiLeaks had tried to rig the election. In doing this, the Democrats and the national security state created a real crisis of legitimacy for the whole bourgeois democratic system. And they did that in order to delegitimize not just the Trump administration, but all dissent in the United States. The Democrats became the most aggressive war party, and the party of censorship, and the party of fear-mongering. They became the new McCarthyite party. So now, the corporate electoral duopoly consists of a Republican white man's party, whose organizing principle is white supremacy, and a Democratic warmongering party, whose organizing principle these days is bashing Russia and sliming dissidents as dupes of Russia.
Rest in peace, Glenn Ford, one of the most amazing, prolific writers, speakers, somebody who was such a revolutionary, such an inspiration to me and many others. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 51, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, Fascist Ukraine and Imperialist NATO, exposing the fascist government in Ukraine, backed by the West, backed by the imperialist forces, and their war against the Russian people, the Slavic people. Today, we're going to debunk some of the mainstream media coverage of the so-called Russia-Ukraine conflict. We're going to talk about how Ukraine is being used as a proxy to provoke military tensions with Russia, the ongoing military offensive against Russia, and how it impacts Black, brown, working class people all around the world, racism, fascism, the interconnections between fascism in Eastern Ukraine against ethnic Russians and fascism against Black and brown people across the world with NATO, with US imperialist system. And joining me today is a comrade I have a lot of respect for, and actually one of the very few people I've ever voted for, by the way, in the U.S. political system, Ajamu Baraka. Ajamu is the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace. Shout out to the Black Alliance for Peace. Please visit their website and become a member. I'm a member myself, and Black Alliance for Peace does amazing work. Ajamu was the 2016 candidate for vice president of the U.S. on the Green Party ticket. He is an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report, who we heard Glenn Ford from in the beginning, an amazing writer and speaker. And Ajamu was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial 2019 Peace Prize and the Serena Shirm Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism, and a member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council. How's it going, Ajamu?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for inviting me. And, you know, it's interesting because the first time that I voted in my life was, in fact, in 2016. And it was kind of freaky to do that. You know, I told the lady when I went in there, she said, do you need any assistance? And I said, yes. And she thought I was kidding, but I had never voted before. So I needed someone to show me how to do it. So, no, I'm glad to be here. I really was moved by that intro with our dear comrade, brother Glenn Ford. We really lost a voice and a mind that we really need today, because this is such a critical moment in history. But I'm glad to be here. I've been watching you and watching the shows, and now I feel confirmed, and I finally ended up on your show. It's a real honor to be here.
Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate that. And I totally agree with you in terms of the big loss of Glenn Ford. I think what made him really unique, and I think what inspired me and many others, is that he was one of the first people to really call out the Democratic Party collusion, subversion of genuine movements, right? We support Black Lives Matter. We support Black liberation and attempts to improve conditions for Black, brown, working class people. But Glenn Ford was one of the few people to actually call it like it is. He wasn't tied to the DNC. He wasn't tied to these NGO industrial complex organizations that had to convince people to vote Democrat, vote for Hillary. He called out the Black misleadership class that supported wars and invasions and attempts. He was one of the first people to really call out what has popularly been described as intersectional imperialism, or attempts, or as Comrade Erica Keynes has said before, identity reductionism, to try to co-opt these movements, social justice, racial movements, for empire, for imperialism. And one of the biggest figures of that, unfortunately, has been a Congresswoman, Maxine Waters, who, you know, we'll talk about that later on. But why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia right now? It's very concerning because one thing that we saw in 2014 with the fascist coup in Ukraine, with Euromaidan, we're seeing more conflict again, where US, NATO, and fascist forces are trying to provoke war and tension with Russia. The way it's painted in mainstream media, they make it seem like Russia just woke up and wants to invade Ukraine for no reason, and now NATO and the US has to step in and save these poor Ukrainians fighting for democracy. What's actually going on right now?
Imperialism. it's really important that we try to help people to understand the historical context of all of these policies, because one thing that has been quite effective has been imperialism's ability to frame their aggression in these humanitarian terms. The notion that the U.S. Represents the European forces represent innocence against these irrational, evil forces, be it the Russians or the Chinese or you name it. But they've been somewhat effective in doing that over the last couple of decades. So it's important that we refute that with a different framework, a different understanding, because in the end, if there is in fact a shooting war between the U.S. and Russia, that can quickly escalate into a nuclear confrontation, and all of us will be impacted. If it doesn't escalate into a nuclear confrontation, if there is the introduction of U.S. forces through NATO, then it's going to be the working class with boots on the ground involved in this conflict. So, we want people to understand they have no interest at all in being involved in these imperialist conflicts. But to get to that point, we have to provide some degree of historical context. So as you started in your conversation, in your question, let's go back. What happened in Ukraine and why Ukraine? Well, I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but the very facts that we have to deal with is this, that it was in fact the U.S. involved in, not just involved, but in fact encouraging and helping to organize a coup against the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych. A coup. Once that coup was executed, and it was a very strange situation, because many people argue when the reactionary forces, many of them infiltrated, not just infiltrated, but led by these right-wing neo-Nazi forces, took over the Maidan and were confronting the security forces in some very interesting and effective kinds of tactics. The question kept on coming up: well, why didn't the Ukrainian state just move in and basically, end the insurrection, if you will? But that didn't happen. It didn't happen for a number of very interesting kinds of reasons. It didn't happen because in some ways, some people believe that the Russians were encouraging the Ukrainians not to, in fact, to clamp down as they were getting prepared for the Olympics in Russia. And so it went on for months until finally it got to a point where it was make or break. And when it came to when push came to shove, Yanukovych basically left town, and the coup was in fact successful. Once the coup occurred, then you have a political crisis even deeper inside the country, because you had large sectors of the population that did not in fact support the coup, including most of the regions in eastern Ukraine. These were the regions where you had significant numbers of Russian-speaking folks, people have real long and close ties to Russia and to the old Ukraine, and they refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new government, which makes sense. You have a coup, it's illegal, you refuse to go along with it. Now, in most cases, U.S. authorities would be they would pretend to be in support of that, okay? But in this case, no. They, in fact, encouraged the illegal government of Ukraine to, in fact, force its will on the people of the East, because the people of the East said, not only will we not recognize this new government, as a consequence of its actions, we want to be, in fact, independent. we see that basically this government is in the pockets of imperialism. It has violated all the principles of Ukrainian independence, and we want nothing with it. Instead of that being dealt with in a non-violent way, this illegal government, along with its supporters from the neo-Nazi paramilitary sectors, they attacked, and a war ensued. And the consequence of that conflict, real quickly, was that basically the independent forces were able to maintain themselves. In fact, when they talk about that the Russians, really want to invade and take over Ukraine, at one point, when the paramilitaries and the Ukrainian army had suffered a catastrophic defeat at a little town, little city called Ilovich, where they were encircled and basically wiped out. The path to Kiev and the control of the capital was wide open. Did they take advantage of that? They marched across the country and take over? No, they didn't. No, they didn't. So but what that did do, it resulted in the Minsk agreement to try to mitigate the conflict and try to bring some kind of diplomatic solution to the conflict. And that agreement was in place. It was violated to a certain extent, but it didn't result in all-out war until the Biden administration came back into power, and they began to encourage the Ukrainian authorities to consider to take back the region by force. And that was the beginning of the escalation of tensions, because the Russians and Russian authorities said, basically, you are crossing a red line. We're not going to allow for an invasion to take place, for war to take place on our doorstep. And we're not going to allow you to establish NATO in Ukraine with the erratic and reckless kinds of policies we've seen you pursue over the last few decades. And that was the beginning of the escalation of this very dangerous situation we find ourselves in Ukraine today.
Thank you for that breakdown. I find that to be very helpful. And it's important to understand that context, because none of it is really being mentioned in mainstream media. Ajamu, one thing that I always look for in mainstream media is who is being attacked, who's being slandered. Undoubtedly, Russia and the Russian people are being slandered, like you said, as these heartless, cruel enemies just seeking to invade. The Ukrainian fascist government and the pro-EU NATO camp is being portrayed as a democracy, freedom-loving people. And I find the optics and the branding of color revolutions and imperialist interventions very important to study, because it shows a lot about the new strategies and techniques. And 2014, I feel, in Ukraine with the Euromaidan, with that fascist coup that overthrew Yanukovych, that was really a test to this new strategy of imperialism, of having a hipster, I call it like hipster fascism. On the outside, it has this hipster appeal. Like, what I want to do is I want to share this image with you of this was one of the protests in Ukraine of the Euromaidan. The police are defending the democratically elected president of Ukraine at the time, who's obviously pro-Russia, pro-China. And the protester here, you can't see it in the picture, but it has an EU flag on the piano. And I feel like the optics of this, it reminds me of Tiananmen Square, and it reminds me of this is the branding of imperialism today, right? Where it's like the anti-imperialist forces are portrayed as cold, as steel, metallic. These police officers who are, and people in the US will see that and they'll try to link it with, oh, okay, those are like these racist cops in the US, so they have to be just as bad, right? And then you have this pro-EU, pro-NATO protester, wearing a hipster sweater, playing the piano, and he's like this creative guy just expressing love. And it reminds me of this new strategy of imperialism that is very much about just using optics and branding, which I think they do so efficiently. And another one that I want to show is this one. You know, you would see these images of like women with the flowers in their head, branded as like almost like in a feminist way, where they're trying to portray them as revolutionaries, as being to the left of the governments that exist. And I feel that in a way, what it does is that it kind of rebrands the true nature of the imperialist regime change operation, because something that you hit on something very important earlier, which is the fact that within the coup there was a lot of fascist elements. Now the picture we're looking at is Kiev after the fascist coup. If you look all the way to the left, you'll see a flag that's very familiar, especially to those in the U.S., and that's the Confederate flag. One of the flags that was hung in the Kiev town hall building after the fascist Maidan, Euromaidan. A lot of fascist groups were part of that coup and continue to be part of the government today. One of them is the Azov Battalion, which is explicitly anti-Russian. They support a figure by the name of Stephen Bandera, who was a Nazi collaborator during World War II. A lot of the figures in the Ukrainian government today come from that realm of the Western Ukrainian pro-German, pro-Nazi, anti-Russian side that is vehemently against communism. By the way, Ukraine banned the use of the hammer and sickle. So if you use like a fist or a hammer and sickle or any symbol like that, you can get arrested and you're seen as being a pro-Russian agitator. So that's what I think is important, is just to kind of break the optics, right? Because I think optics and symbols, we as human beings, we are very much based on images and optics. And in appearance in mainstream media, we're given these images of these hipster creative types, the piano and the flower. But in essence, they're really when it really comes down to it, a lot of what they who they are and what they do is fascism. And what I want to do is I want to read a few excerpts. You have a great article. By the way, please everybody check out Black Agenda Report. This is Ajamu's great article, Ukraine, What Does It Have to Do with Black Folks? I just want to read a few excerpts and get some more commentary from you. So he said, the worldview of liberals usually ends at the borders of the U.S. settler state until they are mobilized by the oligarchy to provide ideological cover for the latest imperialist intrigue. This is as true for the liberal black, quote, misleadership class as it is for Euro-American liberals. But U.S. centrism and class collaboration are not just maladies of the liberal class. Self-identified radicals or liberals from all backgrounds also suffer from this affliction, resulting in a very thin social base for anti-imperialism in the US and even throughout Western Europe. So Ukraine, Russia, and NATO feel like a world away and in no way relevant to the everyday grind that the millions of working people are forced to engage in as part of this vicious, backwards socio-economic system called capitalism. However, because of the startling incompetency of the Biden administration, the strong possibility of a misstep in Ukraine could very well lead to a nuclear confrontation with Russia, making the situation in Ukraine as significant as life itself for all of us. What is in play? And then here you mentioned obviously some of the pro-imperialist propaganda operations that have been taking place over the past few weeks. I do want to skip to this one part of the article that I felt was really good. Or you talked about this, Donetsk and Lugansk as well, the two regions in eastern Ukraine that were anti-fascist, fighting against the fascist government. What I want to do is, I think this paragraph right here was the geostrategic objective of expanding NATO right up to Russia's doorstep is taking precedence over any considerations of what more war might mean for the peoples of Ukraine. But unlike US imperial actions and largely defenseless global South nations, the Russian leadership countered that any war and the expansion of NATO would constitute an existential threat, that they would be forced to respond decisively. So this is something that is not just right now, it's affecting obviously Russia, but this is something that can impact people all over the world. And one of the things that I think about is Libya and the US imperialist invasion of Libya, the overthrow of Gaddafi. And in many ways, I feel like what's going on right now with Russia and Ukraine is sort of a test to be used against other nations around the world, Iran, China, Venezuela, Cuba. What is the urgency and the impact of the peace movement, of the anti-imperialist movement, of opposing this renewed offensive against Russia? Because sometimes people on the left have this view of like, oh, well, Russia is no longer socialist, or it's just as bad as the US empire. And so what happens is that they end up taking by default the imperialist position of not speaking out against NATO US aggression against Russia. Tell us a little bit about the urgency and the importance of opposing a new war on Russia, because it seems like sometimes some of the left is kind of asleep on this.
Well, and that's why I make the argument that there's such an incredibly thin base for anti-imperialism and anti-war sentiment in the U.S. The issue with Russia is not even the issue with Russia is that if you do not understand what's in play, then objectively you will be in alignment with the imperialist interests, the imperialist objectives of the U.S. and some elements of the ruling class in Western Europe. That you will be supporting an incredibly dangerous situation that could engulf all of us in some kind of nuclear confrontation. That's one. But secondly, you would abdicate your responsibility of helping people to understand that this issue of war and conflict is an inevitable historical element of imperialist competition. So the issue is not so much that the Russians are no longer socialists, but the issue is that what we're seeing are conditions that are very similar to what we saw, for example, in the run-up to the first imperialist war or World War I. That with this global instability, with this fact that we are in this sort of period of transition, where it's quite clear that the colonial capitalist system can no longer continue in the same form, or where there's complete disarray, confusion among the international bourgeoisie, that you have the U.S. state that believes that it can come out of this intact with its historic hegemonic position by engaging in a military first strategy. And so that military first strategy is not only endangering us in Russia, in Ukraine, but also in this insane so-called pivot to Asia and the confrontation with the Chinese, or with elements of the foreign policy community believing that they can, in fact, execute a first strike nuclear attack on China, on the Russians. They want to basically house or to deploy hypersonic missiles in the European theater and in the Indo-Pacific theater, with the possibility that they can launch an attack, catch the missiles of the Chinese and the Russians in their silos, and basically avoid a retaliatory counter strike. And this is being talked about in rational terms, if you will. It's Dr. Strangelove all over again. So, we have a responsibility to help people to understand that this is not in our interest, that basically our interest is in sharpening the contradictions between ourselves and this insane ruling class, to make sure that we don't allow these hipster kind of tactics to confuse the people. Because what you demonstrated in those images is a very sophisticated campaigning that they've been involved in for the last couple of decades, using culture, understanding that the terrain of consciousness is in fact in play, and so they use all these hip kinds of themes, these notions of the West being with the gods against evil, the sort of theological kinds of things. They use youth culture, and all of this didn't just come out of thin air. This was systematically developed beginning in places like Serbia, understanding that the student youth sector was in fact a sector that was in play. And we saw the kind of techniques that you showed in those images. We saw it also in places like in Syria, in Nicaragua, and in Venezuela.
Yep.
The leading sector of reaction being the youth student sector. Okay, so this is a very, very sophisticated campaign. The consequence of it, though, interesting enough, in my opinion, is that the campaign has been effective in disarming the so-called left in the U.S. and in Western Europe. So that basically they have fallen right in line with first the focus on personalities, be it Assad or Putin or whatever, as opposed to looking at social forces. They call themselves materialists, but that's all bullshit, and and allow themselves to give left ideological cover to U.S. U.S. imperialist intrigue. They disarm opposition because they say that if you are opposing these rescue missions, if you will, these humanitarian interventions, then you basically, you part of the problem. You are a Putin, poodle, or whatever, whatever cute terms they come up with, and people have fallen for that. And so basically, it's been very difficult to reorganize a more effective anti-war and anti-imperialist movement in the U.S. because of these shifts in consciousness and the objective reactionary positions being taken by the so-called left.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. And I think a big part of that is what Glenn Ford and others have described as the Black misleadership class and other people who have been bought off by the Democrats and the DNC to promote pro-imperialist talking points. What I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is from a few years ago. This is from Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, talking about Russia, Putin, Trump. And I want to play this and get some more analysis or reaction from you in terms of how people like Maxine Waters and others are upheld in mainstream media to promote imperialist regime change.
I think Americans should be very, very concerned that this president sat down with Putin, who we know hacked into our election system, to the DNC, and to many of the states that are now coming forward with this information, and to sit down with him and not have a real discussion, a real conversation, and delve into our real concerns about this happening and get a commitment from Putin that they would never do it again. Americans want to hear that kind of conversation. Obviously, this president went into the room. He brought it up because he had to. There was so much pressure leaving, America from the media and everybody else. He could not afford to go into that room and not pretend that he was dealing with the issue. But he really didn't deal with it. He took it up first. It was dismissed, and Tillerson said it was intractable. Now let's move on. And this thing about a commission and also about, what they're going to do with Syria and having some kind of cessation of the war there. Well, I don't know if Putin is in a position to absolutely negotiate and make all the decisions for Syria. Not that I care about Assad, but I would assume that he would have something to say about it. So I think we're getting played. We're getting played by our president, and certainly we're getting played by Putin. I don't like the idea that our president, again, would go into a room without any note takers, without any staff, without others who should be in the room who really understand foreign policy and who really understand Putin, and come out of it, saying how honored he is, to meet with him and how, in fact, they're going to start working together. This is all about lifting those sanctions. And of course, Tillerson was in the room because that's at the top of his agenda, to lift those sanctions so that they can drill into the Arctic. So you have Trump, who's agreeing to lifting the sanctions, and Tillerson with the foreign minister of Russia, of course, who is supporting whatever Mr. Putin wants to do and whatever his country wants. And so that's what this is all about.
There you have it. You have Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who shout out to Comrade Erica, by the way, who said, I'm getting tired of Auntie Maxine. Yeah, it's really disgusting when they call her that and try to rebrand her talking points in favor of empire. Your reaction, Ajamu?
First, it confirms what Glenn talked about in that opening clip. That basically we have to be reminded that it was the CIA that first used some of the talking points coming out of the Clinton campaign to suggest that Trump was some kind of Manchurian candidate, because the objective was basically to make it impossible for Trump to, in fact, govern. This was taken up by the Black Misleadership class and all of the liberals. And the consequence, as Glenn said, was the general deepening of the legitimation crisis that's gripped the U.S. Institutions and structures for the last couple of decades, but has gotten even worse over the last decade and a half. So this is complete and utter nonsense. It is also reflected in, for example, once not Bush, almost same thing though. When Trump came into power, you remember what John Lewis said. John Lewis and other Democrats, they said John Lewis boycotted the inauguration because of Trump's alleged connection to Putin. But where was the opposition to conversation with the leader of another major nation when Biden spoke with Putin? In fact, they're going to be speaking again in 2 days, trying to see if they can find a way out of this situation that the U.S. helped to create in the Ukraine. You know, where was the condemnation of the French President Emmanuel Macron when he said that the Europeans need to bring Russia back into the fold? You know, is he now a Putin poodle? So this is the level of discourse that we have to deal with in the U.S. But what's incredible again is it's understandable that liberals would support this kind of nonsense. What's not understandable is that so-called leftists would also give these kinds of positions any kind of credibility, but they have, and they join in with the simplistic reducing of these complex situations to personality kind of conflicts, as opposed to looking at the objective material interests that are in place. They're the ones that will criticize those of us who try to take a consistent anti-imperialist position and say, look, we're not going to allow the working class to spill one drop of blood in defense of the capitalist oligarchy. Okay, there's nothing even that shouldn't even be that radical. That should be and has been a consistent anti-imperialist position. But yet, this is the kind of a role that the Black leadership class takes, and that's why I wrote this piece to talk to African people in the U.S. As part of our conversation, trying to move folks back to a place where we used to be before Barack Obama. African people in the U.S. were the most consistently anti-imperialist sector in the population before Obama. But the objective fact is we have been moved to the right. But we're trying to bring people back, and people are coming back, understanding that we've got to shed ourselves of any sentimentality, any patriotism for this settler colonial system, and call out people like Maxine Waters and other members of this Black misleadership class as the collaborators with the enemy that they are. In fact, they are the enemy also.
Most definitely. And I think another key point that we have to consider when we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, it seems that the Democrats are focused on attacking Russia, provoking war with Russia. The Republicans are obsessed with China, the neocon faction especially. And it really boils down to who's funding these two different wings of empire, right? If we understand that the Democrats and the Republicans are both representatives of empire, as Comrade Glenn Ford mentioned in the clip in the beginning, and we follow the money, we can see that they have different agendas. Like the MSNBC clip that we watched earlier with Maxine, it was recorded at MSNBC Studios, which is located at Rockefeller Center, which was owned by the Rockefeller family. And what was one of the main industries that the Rockefeller family was invested in is oil. the big oil companies run liberal imperialist media. That's why people call it National Petroleum Radio, NPR, and the Ford Foundation. All these institutions have money coming in from these giant oil companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, and it's interesting that once you follow the money, you can see why is it that the Democrats go so hard at Russia in particular, and it's because their corporate overlords are getting direct money from Russia, which is obviously more invested in the oil sector, especially the natural gas, Gazprom and Rosneft. And that's a big competitor to the multinational oil companies that want to monopolize and dominate the global petroleum market. And it's also why those same mainstream media outlets tend to attack Venezuela and Iran as well. And then with China, the neocon faction, the Republicans, they really attack China, especially because of security, because China has been advancing and defending itself against empire, and the Republican neocon military weapons industrial complex are not getting any deals from trade with China. And it seems that they want their share of the slice of the Chinese market. So I always tell people to follow the money, and you'll get a sense of why certain people are attacking certain nations. And what I wanted to ask you as well is, you as somebody who in the past has run for vice president of the US and has campaigned for peace, for dialogue with other nations, maybe if you can share a story or an anecdote of anyone trying to attack you. I'm sure you've been attacked or slandered before by liberals or people on the left for being a stooge of Russia, or do you have any situations or stories like that?
Well, I have more than I could probably get into this last 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Anybody who takes a consistent anti-imperialist position, especially nowadays, you pay a price. You pay a price in terms of attacks on your reputation, attacks on your character. So the positions we have taken in opposition to U.S. imperialism, standing with Cuba, standing with the people of Venezuela, standing with the people of Nicaragua, opposing the intervention of the attack on Libya, helping people to understand what is really happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, reminding people of the abandonment of the people of Bahrain by the Obama administration, reminding people of the coup in Egypt and the coup in Honduras and the coup in Ukraine, reminding people that there could not be this dramatic expansion of the military budget without the cover given to it by Obama, the Democrats, and all of these elements of the most aggressive of the two parties now in terms of war, the Democrats. So when you raise these kinds of questions, and basically you find yourself under attack. And one example of what happened with me, I think some of your listeners know about this, is everybody, I think most people are aware of the Left Forum that comes together, used to come together every year physically. For the first time ever in the history of the Left Forum, there was in fact a political action against a keynote speaker, a person who was closing out the Left Forum a few years ago, and that keynote speaker was me. That basically there was an organized effort. They passed out flyers, a few thousand throughout the Left Forum. At that point, they were accusing me of being an Assadist. Why? Because basically, I'm saying that, why are you all following the U.S. in this attack on Syria? Why are you not pointing out the fact that this is part of a larger and broader strategy that basically is representing the interests of the most aggressive element of U.S. capital, but also the Zionist state? Why are you all not talking about the fact that millions of people inside the country still support their government? Okay. And so just by raising those kinds of questions and suggesting that the left should not be providing cover for yet another intervention into another state in the so-called Middle East, then you become a so-called Assadist. again, that kind of silly reduction to personality and no space to talk about those objective interests that are in play. So yeah, they organized against me, and I've been deplatformed. I don't go on Facebook and talk about all this kind of stuff. It's not that important. It's part of the terrain that exists when you decide to stand up and stand up for the people and in fact speak truth to power, including the power of this backward so-called left in the U.S.
That's crazy. I actually didn't know about that, and my apologies for having that happen to you. I can imagine how frustrating and disgusting that must have been to deal with. And I'm not surprised, to be honest, because a lot of that crowd, the Left Forum, Jacobin, the DSA, or some sectors of the DSA, ISO back when they used to exist, a lot of them are connected to some shady figures. I want to share a tweet. This is an interesting tweet from Ben Norton, the pro-imperialist, quote, socialist at Jacobin Mag, got over 230,000 in 3 years from a right-wing pro-Israel group. And he talks about how, and he has the receipts right here, how the Jacobin publication was getting money from an organization called the Jewish Communal Fund from Israel. And this happens a lot. This happens with a lot of the pro-imperialist left institutions that happen to take these anti-Russia, anti-Syria positions that a lot of times they're connected back to these shady forces that are trying to subvert and capitalize on the left and give a pro-imperialist angle to their take. And I suspect that this is happening more often than we think. And it's really important to, that's why I think it's important to support organizations like Black Alliance for Peace and Black Agenda Report, because you can always tell who's getting money from somewhere. And Black Alliance for Peace is very grassroots. It's not getting money from these fancy think tanks and, Israeli institutions. But then you see other, stuff, some Left Forum stuff or Jacobin, and you're like, where are you guys getting your money from? And that's why I always tell people, follow the money and you'll get a sense of why certain people are taking certain positions. Same thing happened with Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman and especially her discussing coverage of Syria, of Nicaragua, of Russia, just repeating the talking points of the imperialist camp. And I think it's really important to call that out, because a lot of times they brand themselves as people on the left, that they're the loudest representatives of the so-called left. But in many ways, they're just giving a left-wing aesthetic to imperialist propaganda. One other thing that I wanted to ask you is, what do you think with everything going on in Russia and Ukraine, right? So we know that the U.S. is trying to step up war and aggression against Russia with Ukraine, provoke a war on that front, right? Western Russia, Eastern Ukraine. Another major development that has happened within the last few weeks, within the last few days in particular, has been Kazakhstan. We've seen these so-called protests that have been taking place. We know that Kazakhstan is a key, crucial nation in the Belt and Road Initiative between China, Russia, has huge fields of natural gas, has been cooperating also with other countries, with Venezuela. How do you think also Kazakhstan plays into this in terms of the U.S. attempt to destabilize Eurasia and the Belt and Road Initiative?
No, I think it's a very dangerous situation, but in a very, very complex one also. One of the strategies of imperialism is that they'll open up multiple fronts on you. One of the ways of understanding Ukraine, and I'll come back to Kazakhstan in a second. One of the ways of understanding what unfolded in Ukraine is to connect that to what was unfolding, in fact, in Syria. That basically Ukraine became a second front against Russia because of its policies in Syria. Mm-hmm. And so right now, as they are escalating tensions in Ukraine and getting ready to go into this meeting in 2 days between Biden and Putin, they decided to try to take advantage of what was some serious splits in the government there, and to move and to have some forces attempt, what it looked to be, an attempt to take over the government, to in fact exercise or to execute a coup. It's quite clear that when you look at how things moved, that this is more than just a spontaneous protest, even though, and I think we need to let people know this, there are some legitimate oppositional forces in the country, forces that have been consistently pro-socialist, who were opposed, who have been opposed to some of the opening up of the economy to neoliberal exploitation. You have Exxon and Chevron in the country. You have so there's some real issues there, but of course you have also right-wing forces. You have provocateurs who allow themselves to be used and to hijack what might be a legitimate progressive opposition and turn it into a weapon that ends up being used against the people themselves. So, you have this crisis now, but the way it's been moving toward some degree of resolution was that the current president fired the ex-president who was in control of the Security Council, and the kind of ambivalence and uncertainty among the security forces a day or two ago seems to have been dissipated, and there's some degree of stability being imposed again. But you're right, part of the reason why this was done, and it's not over yet, is in fact to undermine the Eurasia Economic Union, the Belt and Road Initiative, because Kazakhstan plays a very important role in those relationships, in that process, and to ferment chaos, to again have the Russians who felt compelled to respond to the request for security assistance to move decisively, unlike how they moved in the Ukraine. So again, it plays into the propaganda of the Russians who are just trying to reestablish empire, and supports that narrative, and it continues to undermine the legitimacy of positions on the part of imperialists, anti-imperialists in the U.S. To try to galvanize public support, to put pressure on the U.S. to stop engaging in these kinds of provocative, dangerous policies in Ukraine, China, and really around the world.
Most definitely. And even looking at a map of Eurasia, we can see obviously Ukraine all the way to the west, which is not highlighted on this map, but very crucial entrance into Russia. And Ukraine is an important chess piece on the board, so to speak, for the West and for NATO. But looking at Kazakhstan as well, Kazakhstan is one of the main arteries of trade between China, Russia, and is one of the central passageways along the Belt and Road Initiative for European nations to trade with China and Russia as well. And I also find it interesting that Kazakhstan also borders Xinjiang, Western China, which is one of the areas that the US imperialists have been trying to accuse the Chinese government of carrying out what they describe as a genocide of Uyghur Muslims in China, and have been trying to foment war and destabilization in Western China. And this area, I think, is going to be hotly contested. We're going to see more of a U.S. presence. And it's interesting that one of the nations in which the U.S. military has been building up its presence that we don't really hear about is Kyrgyzstan, a very small country south of Kazakhstan, which borders Kazakhstan, China, is close to Afghanistan. I think Central Asia in the next few years is going to play a very important role because the U.S. imperialists want to carve out their space and take over that chessboard because they see a threat from Russia and China. And I think one of the most fascinating things, Trump has said a lot of dumb stuff throughout the years, and obviously I'm not a fan of Trump, but one of the things that he said, truth bombs that he once said, that I think is important to keep in mind is that he said one of the biggest mistakes that the US made was bringing Russia and China together. And I think that's one of the things that he revealed, that the US intelligence apparatus is trying to separate Russia and China, divide the Eurasian project because of its success today. And I think it's important, even whatever your political views are about certain governments, I think the position should always be, hands off Kazakhstan, hands off Ukraine, no intervention, no US imperialist NATO interference in those countries, because anytime that NATO, the US enters one of these places, things always end up worse. And I always point to Libya as a perfect example. The left was so, in the US in particular, was so misinformed and confused about that. I was somebody who supported and defended Gaddafi against empire. And I remember some ISO people at the time, when they were around, they were trying to talk shit about me because I was defending Gaddafi at a protest. And it's just crazy to see how this is all happening again, where you have certain sectors of the so-called left cheering for war against Russia. But if NATO and the West gets its hands on Russia and tries to destabilize, balkanize the country, things are going to end up a lot worse. And that's what I tell people. But Ajamu, it's great. It's been really great speaking with you. Any final comments or analysis on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and any good sources of information to follow in terms of all of everything that's been going on?
Well, the last few comments in terms of what you've been laying out these last few minutes is, yes, we need, the left needs to take a resolute position against NATO. We say in the Black Alliance for Peace that NATO should be dismantled. It is a white supremacist structure that has no business continuing to exist today. So we say shut down NATO. It's important to understand that one of the reasons why you see the U.S. now intensifying its efforts in Kazakhstan is a consequence of of them being pushed out of Afghanistan.
Yeah,
because you're absolutely right. The Central Asia is in play, and part of the reason why it's in play is because of the defeat of the U.S. in Afghanistan. Even though we know that that war was really objectively over about 11 years ago, but we predicted in the Black Alliance for Peace. In fact, we're one of the few anti-imperialist organizations that kept on top of Afghanistan and was putting out a tremendous amount of information throughout 2021 on the situation in Afghanistan. We predicted that the U.S. was going to just redeploy its forces and its attention into other parts of Central Asia, and we're seeing the consequence of that today. So we say, if you want to stay on top of these issues and actually to be involved in trying to oppose them, if you're a non-African, please consider joining the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network. If you're an African, join the Black Alliance for Peace. We don't just sit around and pontificate and put out statements. We organize, and we're attempting to build an effective anti-imperialist movement. We're connecting up our anti-imperialism with the fight right in the heart of the empire in the United States of America. So we have only a little time left. We've got to build an effective anti-imperialist movement, an effective revolutionary movement in the U.S. This is one attempt, one part of that process. We don't see the Black Alliance for Peace being a permanent organization. We see it as a very important transitional one right now. We say that we got to get organized. If you're not in an organization, get into an organization. Build solidarity among all colonized and working class people. Understand that we are, in fact, the majority, but we got to be organized. So build organization, build solidarity, educate yourself on these issues, and don't allow anybody to intimidate you into taking positions that are in alignment with that of this backward, racist, corrupt, criminal state and system.
Beautifully said, Ajamu. It's been a real pleasure having you on, and I look forward to having you back on again. Ajamu is the national organizer of Black Alliance for Peace. Please support Black Alliance for Peace. Become a member, $10 a month or more. Go to their website. Highly suggested. One of the best grassroots, non-corporate organizations resisting empire. And Ajamu is a 2016 candidate for vice president of the U.S. on the Green Party ticket. Consistent anti-imperialist, an editor and contributing columnist for Black Agenda Report. Please also support Black Agenda Report and check out Ajamu's amazing article on Russia and Ukraine. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. Thank you so much, Ajamu, for joining. I love and respect your work. Thank you so much. We're going to go out to some amazing music from the great Paul Robeson performing in Moscow. Peace out, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? He delivered Daniel from the lion's den, Jonah from the belly of the whale, and the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace, and why not every man? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? The moon runs down in a purple stream, the sun refused to shine. Every star did disappear, yes, freedom shall be mine. Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not